Super excited about talking with everyone today around the subject of meetings. And as we dive into this, we will, as Alex shared with you, begin to address a little bit of what is the foundation for us to be able to design and manage meetings to unleash potential. As a means to do this, just a little bit about In Rhythm. We've been working together in the context of serving organizations for several years, and we have over 50 years of experience with all those involved, and a diverse bout of backgrounds, from ones working in kind of ecosystem or land restoration, to working with businesses and tech companies, to different nonprofits and government and community projects. So really, we've got a wide range of experience working with people who work on teams, planning and designing meetings in all kinds of different industries and areas around the world. And definitely have enjoyed myself spending time in different countries doing this kind of work. So with that, we're just going to jump in. The overview, we're going to talk a little bit about the problem that we experience, and all of us have experienced with meetings. We're going to dive a little bit into what do we think the potential is if that change or design is improved. We're going to talk about our principled approach, and then we're going to talk about productivity. And productivity in the context of regeneration, or this idea of how do we regenerate potential in organizations through the structure of meetings. So, are meetings important? I think it's a really important question, but I want us to answer that question by the stats, which is really interesting. We have 11 meetings, or we're estimated that we have 11 million meetings every single day in the United States, that people attend an average of 62 meetings per month, and every person spends an average of no less than 30 minutes, but as many as 60 minutes. And it represents anywhere from 25 to as high as 50% of our typical work week. And actually, in executives who are in larger organizations, they're estimating that it could be as high as 65% of someone's work week is actually in meetings. So the question, are meetings important? Well, if we decide to answer that question based on the amount of time we spend in meetings, I don't think we have any controversy on are they or are they not important. However, I think this gets into the heart of what makes this so challenging. And so when we talk about meetings, in addition to people spending so much time, they're quite opinionated. And as you can see on this graphic here, in reference to those who are participating in meetings, self-identifying their own challenges, like 90% of meeting participants daydream, 73% are busy on other work during meetings, which I am sure all you guys are doing right now. And because we're always multitasking, we've got a lot of things we're doing. We also recognize or hear that of those participants, 50% of them would say the meeting's completely unproductive, or that the time that they spend on average in meetings is too much compared to their overall work week. So these are the things that continue to create challenges within meetings. And I think we all have experienced it emotionally. So as a way to kind of tap into that emotion, we're going to spend a couple of minutes. I'm going to let you watch a video, Meetings, Bloody Meetings.
Oops, I think you maybe need to turn your volume on, Trey, because we can hear it through your mic. Yeah, and maybe turn it up a bit.
You're charged with chairing without due thought and preparation. How do you plead? I think I'm supposed to be. But this is a dream. Sorry, I'm late. What are we talking
talking about this morning?
Well, we better talk about that first. Other agenda. Item 1, the agenda. Well, I always think it's very useful to get together like this, you know, just to see if...
Is there any point in having got together?
What?
I think you'd better tell us what the charge is.
Well, I haven't given it that much thought, quite honestly. When I've, you know, things been a bit hectic down the station this week, I thought we could sort of work something out when we all got together.
Second charge, failure to signal your intentions to the meeting.
Can we take item 1 now?
I am taking item 1 now. Improving company communication.
No, Ron, it's not the computer, it's the telephone. What? Look, every time we try and get through down there, they're engaged.
What? Oh, is it?
What? Well, what extra maintenance will they need? What will they cost?
Well, I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Look, the point of putting this on the...
It's a fake. The painting is a fake.
Oh,
Did he sell it?
definitely not.
Third charge, negligent ordering of agenda and criminal misallocation of time.
Look, I want to take this order if we can, okay? It's McKenna, so if we can do this one, they may come back.
Ron, well, I think we're making a mistake.
Look, I'm sorry, it's 10 to now, all right?
Yes, well, if we hadn't wasted 45 minutes discussing the bloody park...
That was urgent. The park opens on Monday.
Fourth charge, not being in full control of your discussion.
My problem is that people are still getting sick on Fridays and Mondays.
What your lads need, Ron, is a bit of discipline.
It depends on what you mean by discipline.
Well, I'll tell you what I mean by discipline. Nailing a few of them to the front gates. That's what I mean.
Shut up, Marcus.
I've got a hunch we did him about 5 years ago for forgery, or it could have been arson. He thinks he was taught.
It was forgery.
No, never.
Didn't anyone write down what the judge said?
Well, we all thought we knew what had been decided. Next item.
What?
To discuss and decide exactly what it was that we did discuss and decide at the last meeting.
So part of the reason to share that is to just get us into a little bit of this kind of emotional engagement around what is it that we're actually trying to solve. And all of us find ways that we can probably improve how we engage and do meetings, but reality is it's more difficult than how we've approached it in the past to solving this. So what are the things that we're trying to solve? Here are just a few things that we've talked about, show up in that video, show up in some of the different stats that we read on meetings, which is we're looking for increased productivity, more efficiency, team engagement, better decision-making, new ideas. The thing is we continue to spend time trying to redesign meetings the exact same way over and over again, expecting we're going to get a different result. And I wonder, and I hope to challenge you today, is there a different design that we could consider as a part of designing meetings? Dave Barry is a columnist in the US, and this is what he wrote. He says, if you had to identify in one word the reason why the human race has not achieved and never will achieve its full potential, that word would be meetings. So for me, it's fun to recognize that we're across the board challenged by this. And I think we're challenged by this for a couple of different reasons. And we're going to step back a little bit into what do you think is the dominant metaphor for how we describe and manage an organization? Some of you may drop some thoughts into the chat field if you want. And just what do you think the dominant metaphor is? And Alex, if you don't mind, you can just unmute and share some of those that get shared. But when we think about how we manage meetings, how we actually manage organizations, how we describe them, how do we communicate about them, what are those dominant metaphors that we use?
All right, we've got Lisa says herding cats. Gretchen says formulaic. Herding cats.
Love it. Awesome.
Aurora says industrial, mechanical.
Very good. So all of those are ways we describe it. But I think the most dominant one is the one that was just mentioned, is this idea of mechanical. And it's so dominant in terms of our visuals of organizations, our communications in organizations, that we often show people this kind of image when we're trying to design or engage or discuss organizations. And so here you see, you got teams as cogs, the entire business as a machine, and at the very bottom, you see the outputs being profits, right? And then on the other side, we see a whole state in the United States being seen as a machine with logistics and offices and economic development all being the cogs to generate more opportunity. Well, there's some interesting things about seeing ourselves, our organizations, our economies as machines. And we even use language, working like a well-oiled machine, or I don't have bandwidth for that. And I often find myself even diving deeply into seeing this work differently, find idioms that I use that I didn't even consciously realize I was using them. And I often, and Alex and others will correct me when I say, you know, I'm not sure we have bandwidth for that. I mean, it really is this idea of, do we have the ability to see across some of the things that are influencing our designs? And so knowing that machines or this mechanistic approach is informing a lot of our decision making, my question to you is, how do we think that dominant metaphor has informed our design of meetings? And I'm just going to pause for a second. And maybe some of you feel like immediately something comes to mind, you can drop it in the chat. But I think it's more powerful than we realize, because when we look to try to address meetings, we're tending to just reorganize the same agendas over again and trying to get a different outcome. But maybe it's because our underlying design is got us capped and put us in a box of how that looks. So when we think about that design, one of the things that I think it does is it's all this idea of centralization. So we've used meetings as a way to centralize decision-making. We've used it as a way to centralize control and accountability and behavior, and even centralize thinking. How many times have you guys been a part of? I have. Many meetings where we show up and we're not engaged, we're not participants, we're not being asked to participate by sharing our voice or perspective. It's actually designed to tell others what somebody else's decision was. And it really is interesting how that infiltrates all aspects of our designs. And I often say to some CEOs and executives, are we using meetings as a disguise to centralize our decision making? So that somebody's made a decision and now we're going to use the meeting as a way to communicate that decision and make sure everybody's on the same page. So to me, these are some things that I think the machine design has really influenced in terms of how we are currently operating and engaging meetings. Now think about this. Are you lonely? Are you tired of working on your own? Hate making decisions? Hold a meeting. You can see people, show charts, feel important, point with a stick, eat snacks, impress your colleagues, all on company time. And yes, don't forget that meetings are the practical alternative to work. Right? So for me, part of that has been our collective experiences. It's really designed around a few people versus it being designed to create even more engagement and more empowerment across an entire team. So with that, I think this is how we tend to feel, right? If this is all about me and what I'm trying to get done, what we tend to do is if we see organizations as machines, we see our teams as cogs, what does it say about people? Right? We're just parts in that machine. And I really believe our meeting design is so modeled after this mechanistic machine design that we can't even see it. And that's part of what we're going to break up today, is being able to hopefully create awareness that this is a direct result of how we have been managing organizations for centuries. So what are the consequences? Right? What are the consequences of treating people as parts of a machine? And so we've talked through some of this, which is this disengagement. Gallup has come out with this, and they continue to get more and more research done that we really have in terms of people that are not engaged and actively disengaged, somewhere in the vicinity of 80+% of the workforce. That is insane. But what's interesting is just think about that stat in reference to meetings. It's almost synonymous. Those who are disengaged in a meeting as a percentage is about the exact same as what's disengaged in organizations. It's no different. The majority of us would rather be someplace else. And the fact of the matter is because of that, there is nothing that we're going to get out of it. And it produces very, very little outcomes that we all really want. And that is costing the United States alone upwards of $500 billion a year in lost productivity. And I think it lands deeply into how we design meetings as well. And what's interesting about this is when people move from that actively disengaged to somewhat disengaged into an engaged or actively engaged, it's 3 times the productivity. So when we talk about this, I had a CEO recently challenge their management team and said, how do we create double the productivity at half the work? Well, right now, I can tell you this is how you do it. When people are disengaged, what we're finding is when they're engaged, it is an exponential increase in outcomes. And so then the challenge for us is not just designing meetings or organizations as a way to engage people, but we also need to design meetings to do that as well. But we also recognize in an average size organization in the United States of 1,000 employees, that's saying actively disengaged is roughly anywhere from 13 to 20%. So let's just say, 20 or 200 employees, with each employee costing on average or losing on average over $17,000 a year of lost productivity. So we're seeing in a small organization like that, or an average size organization in the United States, that could be as upwards of over $2 to $3 million of lost productivity. But what we need to recognize is this is an issue of trying to apply the wrong kind of solution to the wrong kind of problem. And so what we talk about are these types of problems. And so first of all, I just want us to make sure we understand this. So a simple problem would be like baking a cake, right? So here we've got ingredients, we've got recipes, we've got known steps, we know some assumptions, but they're manageable, and we can repeat the results over and over and over again, right? And then there's some more complicated problems that we have where it's a more technical, but it's making things that are more technical, but there's still known inputs. And then there are blueprints and ways of which we can continue to monitor the quality of how we put something together, series of known steps, so that we can have repeatable outcomes. The ability to fly a plane is a perfect example of that. It's super complicated, and we can do it over and over and over again. Now, what's interesting is when we think about meetings, it's complex. And it's complex because the interdependency of the inputs, everybody who shows up is different. They're different personalities. They're different perspectives. And the way that we've tried to manage meetings, interestingly, is is we control it. So you can't talk, right? You've got limited amount of time. We don't want you to bring creativity. Let's just look at the numbers and then let's make a decision and let's move on, right? That sounds more for me like we're trying to use a recipe, and that recipe is going to get us the same results over and over again, but it doesn't. And that's why there's so much disengagement in meetings and so much disengagement in organizations, is that recipe doesn't work in complex systems because it's changing and not every meeting is the same and it shouldn't be the same. And so what can we do to design that differently? And to give you a little more insight into how powerful this is, when we talk about baking a cake and the recipes associated with that and how following that recipe works, how many of you guys have bought a desk from Kia or IKEA, right? Several of us, right? Several of us have bought things where we needed to assemble it. And so those instructions, right, somewhat simple, maybe a little bit complicated in some instances, are super important to making that product, right? Now, think about what it would be like to take, the idea of something emergent or the idea that's complex where there's different variables and applying it to making or baking a cake or building a desk, right? So when we talk about a principle-based approach, imagine what it would look like if all of a sudden I gave you a set of principles and said, now go put that desk together. It would be super frustrating, wouldn't it? But that's kind of what we've done in terms of addressing meetings and organizations in the context of trying to get more out of things. So what happens if we can solve this problem? Well, I think it's similar things. We get this engagement. We get even more organizational resilience. We get team creativity. We get what I consider distributed decision-making, where it's not about one person or centralized. It's about a lot of people across the entire organization. And ultimately, in any organization, we want the customer to get increased value. And if more people are engaged in the organization and in meetings, I got to believe that the customer is going to receive more value as a part of that. So we at InRhythm believe this is nothing but a design issue, and that we can design meetings to be a lot more engaging, a lot more different. We can design organizations to be more engaging and different to be able to get the outcomes that we want. So we want to change the metaphor. We're going to change the metaphor from a mechanistic one to a living systems metaphor. And why would we do such a thing? Mainly because we are all living. And it's really incredible about seeing a living systems as a model versus a mechanistic or a machine as a model, is it starts to value life, right? It starts to value all the different creative aspects of what that life is. And so when you look at that picture, you see all kinds of different species and their contribution in the context of that system. So how would that inform our design of meetings, our design of organizations? Pretty substantially. So for us, these principles of living systems are how we would go about a process of designing an organization and meetings, because it's about engaging people. When we go back to this living system, it is something that every species has a contribution for, and we want to design our meetings and organizations to be the same. So when we think about the principles of living systems, the first thing we think about is holism, which is recognizing in a living system, everything is interrelated and dependent. And we're also going to contrast, or not contrast, but equate living systems with complex systems, which is usually when we think of living systems, it's nature, it's societies, it's economies, it's social communities. And all of those are things we manage together. What's interesting is over the last several hundred years, since that industrial revolution, we've had incredible progress on things we make. Incredible progress. I mean, from the technological advancements is through the roof. And we see that in our technology like iPhones, or our ability to fly airplanes or go to the moon, or all those things. But in the idea of how we managed things, those complex systems, not so much. We've not made very much progress on that. And part of it is we're so used to parts and pieces and cogs and levers that in a living system, they're all interrelated and dependent upon one another. And it's actually almost impossible to separate without losing the whole. The other thing is we recognize in a living system, they're mutualistic. There's some inherent value and dependence on each other, and you design with that in mind. And that each person in the context of social systems actually brings something original and in the possibility of incredible genius into the equation. And that also living systems are a beautiful example of how things evolve over time. But our organizations and definitely our meetings are not examples of how things evolved over time. They're actually extremely static. It's the sickness of best practices that I often talk about, which is if it's worked somewhere else, then it must work for me. And then it kind of doesn't take into account the unique people that are part of that organization or meeting, or the unique differences of those individuals and the context of what that organization is working in. And the other thing is that it's nodal. It's not centralized. It's distributed and decentralized. And all living systems create the conditions for growth, both individually as well as for the entire system. So this actually sets a stage for a very different design for meetings. So when we compare and contrast, what I want us to do right now is I want you to write down, using just the diagram on your screen, what do you think is different? When you think of a living system, I've given you these 6 characteristics of a living system. Now, from a machine design paradigm, what would be the opposite? What would be the opposite of holism? And feel free to chat it up in this point. Alice will share some of those as a part of this process. But we're just giving you a few minutes to work through this.
Hey Trey, just a side note, your audio's been a little scratchy. Maybe take out your headphones.
Okay.
We'll see if that works. Thanks.
I had the volume all the way up. Is that a little better?
Yeah, that's better, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. We've got some coming in the chat. Bill says silos and Gretchen says fragments.
Great. So holistic versus silos or fragments. Perfect.
Compartmentalized.
Compartmentalize, right. How about mutualism or uniqueness or evolutionary? There's some others that come in mind for you guys.
Competition.
Yeah, so mutualism versus competition, or the idea of cooperation versus competition. Perfect.
We've got self-centered and predatory.
Yeah. So now we're getting really on that actively disengaged when we're talking about predatory, right? But this idea that it's in my own self-interest versus in the interest of the whole.
Chase says individualism.
Yeah, so uniqueness versus individualism, right? Awesome. How about evolutionary? What's the opposite?
We've got stagnant.
Stagnant. Another word would be static, right? How about nodal and developmental?
We've got trapped in a box, so evolutionary versus trapped in a box.
All right. So another example of nodal versus would be centralized, right? So, and then developmental versus, any thoughts on that, Alex?
None yet.
When we think about the opposite of developmental is just this idea that everybody is already all they're going to be in the organization, right? And so in a living system, we see the maturation process, the ability for people to mature. And actually in maturation, you get even more resilience and you get more productivity versus expecting people will just be who they are, right? Forever. Awesome. So this just gives us grounds a little bit in this idea that when we talk about living systems and the fact that we're all living, our design should reflect who we are versus a design that's really been better for making things, not managing things. And that's what we're going to start moving away from. So when we talk about the machine design is really perfect in engineering best practices, because you want that machine to do it the same way over and over and over again. And that best practice actually enforces this idea of prescriptions. Instead of something being unique, it's like, hey, if this has worked here, it'll work there. And then in a living systems context, when we're dealing with complexity, what we believe is when we take that approach, it degenerates the health of the system. And that's what's so incredible about this process is it's actually simple in the understanding of it, but we then have to get super creative in understanding the context of what we're talking about to be able to say, so now what does a living systems design mean? It actually informs a principle-based approach, which principles allow us all kinds of flexibility and facilitate this idea of flexible frameworks that we use, that we believe regenerates health because it is considering all the different characteristics of a living system. Now, what's interesting is when you think about those two different contrasting views and thinking, it's interesting, one takes an enormous amount of energy. And all I have to do is show you the stats that you've already seen so far. When we have disengagement at the levels that we have today, it is incredible what amount of energy we need to support a system that's not working. But in a living system, everything is working together, where the sum of the parts are far greater and more exponential on the outcomes. It takes less energy because there's this self-maintenance, and it doesn't need all these external inputs to make it work. Then what we do, knowing that to be the case, is we spend time on shifts. So what we'll talk about is what has to shift. And that shift is in design in the organization, and specifically in meetings in particular. So about the design process, there are a couple of things I'm going to give you some insight into that will help you in this process. The context of design and organization in the meeting, in my opinion, are roughly the same, which is we need to understand why. Design should be based upon purpose, not the problem. I was really inspired by Alan Savory and the Savory Institute and others like Daniela Howe as the CEO and one of the founders. And that is that we've spent too much time designing around a problem versus around the context that we want, that we're in. So what does it look like instead of us having a conversation around why is that meeting not working, and then we're getting into the strategic details of changing it from, well, should the agenda be in advance or should the agenda be emergent, right? Should we spend 10 minutes on this or 15 minutes on this? But all that's in strategy, right? Maybe the underlying design is just already broken. And so what is the purpose? Why are we having these meetings in the first place? And what is the potential we're trying to realize? And how is our current design actually getting in the way of that purpose and that potential? Versus us feeling like we're, designing with something in mind that really is trying to solve the problem of meetings. The other thing is we want to make sure that design process is all about building what I call living capacity. So building living capacity through creating healthy meeting environments. So when you think about health from a meeting standpoint, you should be thinking about how you engage people, not disengage people. So our meeting design shouldn't be about how we are creating efficiency or quote unquote getting the meeting done in the right amount of time versus we all know that if we increase the engagement and the energy of the people that are a part of a meeting, it's going to translate in all of their work, not just in that meeting. So then we go back to the principle of holism and mutualism and recognize that if we change meetings, we change the world because we're spending so much time on it. It's incredible. And I'm actually going to give you more evidence on why that's the case and that we understand its relevance. And so if people are engaged, they have roles to contribute and there's purpose behind it, then people are participating in those decisions. And what's interestingly, which is part of the issue with meetings, is it stops at the meeting. So what happens when we can integrate what happened there in all the other work we're doing? So it's not siloed from everything else. And that communication now is really happening at a level that enhances the things that are going to make real productivity happen in the system. And that is there's clarity and understanding. And then we ask a crazy question like this. Who should be in this meeting versus everybody talking about how in the world they should get out of this meeting, right? I don't know about you, but most meetings, please do not raise your hand and volunteer me for another meeting. But the fact of the matter is when we're designing this way, we actually want to be a part of some of these conversations because we know how much valuable it is. So we need the diversity of opinions, diversities of perspectives, and engaged in a way that actually could create real change. And then we see this. So then when we've got these structures like meetings in place, we design for healthy conditions, not productivity. Why? Because if you see meetings beyond the silo, then you actually know that healthy conditions is going to translate into so much more in all the other relationships that person's going to have, and then all the other interactions, and in all the other work. I actually think you designing a meeting for productivity and efficiency is at the expense of the individual who will take that expense and pass it along to everybody else. And it versus the opposite. You give more energy to people, they walk away and they are looking to give more energy to others. That we also design for principles versus prescription. So no, not every design meeting should be the same. It's depending on the people and the purpose and recognizing that with those people and that purpose, the meeting's going to be different and should be different. Don't get into the mindset that we've got 5 minutes for this. Get into the mindset of how do I create the conditions for this energy to pass from this meeting to you to others that will then pass throughout the organization. We're also moving from systems versus silos. So we're designing for the system. So which means that when we're thinking about the meeting, we can't be just thinking about the meeting. We got to be thinking about the purpose of the organization, the purpose of our products, and the purpose of all our teams and why they exist as a means for that kind of design. And it breaks down those silos. And that we should be designing with evolution in mind, not the static state that doesn't change and doesn't provide value over time and actually reduces relevance as a part of a process. So with that in mind, what you can see is that is what we call brings in these flexible frameworks. And this is our framework for designing. We design meetings this way, we design projects this way, we design organizations this way, where we get clear on the context and what would make a healthy meeting look like, design structures around that so that we can get to work. And all you guys, we all want to work and we all want to have meaningful work, but we don't get to do that if we spend all our time talking about things and spending time in meetings that are not going to support the purpose and the potential that really exists in an organization. And so with that being the case, what we really want us to do is to spend time to recognize potential. So this is provided to us by the Staggering Institute, as I've already mentioned before. And when I see this, and most people see this, it's a place in Mexico, very degraded, not much vegetation, is an example of what happens when things are not being managed for its full potential. But when that management changes, when principles become a part of our design versus prescriptions, what everybody thinks is unrealized or is absolutely degradation or desertification or lack of potential can change for a very short period of time, in less than a decade. And to me, that's the power. So when we think it's unrealized, which is what our meetings look like, right? Our meetings look like this. It's dead. There's no life happening in our meetings, but our meetings should be like this. And all we need to do is begin to see the potential and to design around that potential as a part of this process. And so when we think about this next, so what does this really mean? I want you to think about this real quick. This is, to me, the most powerful thing of what I'm going to say to you today. We have 11 million meetings each day in the US. That's 5.5 million hours. Do you know that's 229,000 days? That is 627.8 years. That's every day what we lose in meetings. Just think about the power of what the potential is if we change all that. 627 years are lost every single day because of how we've designed a meeting. And if we don't think that's important, we've lost perspective. The opportunity is if now people walk away from these meetings empowered, engaged, with more energy, it was less about what they did in the meeting and more about what they're going to do outside of the meeting. And that changes everything. And this, to me, excites the living, what word should I word? The living everything out of me, because this is the potential that we really, really have when we redesign. And I see this in so many different things in business and and in societies and communities, is we really have the opportunity to change it substantially. So plus, that means we got to shift. There's so many shifts. We've got to shift from thinking in parts to wholes. We've got to shift from dominance or centrality to interdependence and distribution. We got to shift from recipes to responses, right? We've got to think about patterns and not trying to predict. We've got to move away from extracting something out of a small place and actually empowering it and creating equity and so much energy in the organization. And all of that will increase decision-making. So for us, regenerative meetings redefined, right? It's a living, evolving, naturally functioning meeting where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. If you see a meeting as living, if you see it as its ability to evolve, and you design it around living people, I actually believe you're going to get abundance, you're going to get potential that you could never possibly imagine, but you've got to do it differently. And that's what the power of this design can do. So we're not going to do the breakout groups, but what I'd like you to do is to spend some time on this. You're going to choose one of these principles, and you're going to say, in light of these principles, what would be a new design that I would think about doing differently in a meeting? And as important as that, what would I stop doing in light of that design? So what would I do and what would I stop doing? And so we're just going to let people throw in some stuff into the chat window, and we're going to use this, and then we'll open it up for questions. Any thoughts, Alex, that you're seeing as a part of the chat?
I will let you know when a thought comes up.
Great.
From the chat.
So we'll give everybody a couple of minutes to just think about, in light of these principles, what would be a new design in meeting? And then what would you stop doing? And if there's a lot of energy around stop doing certain things, then that to me is as important as what the new design would be. So we'll give a couple of minutes.
Gary says holistic thinking is one key.
Great. So when we're in this, in a new design, it's all that interconnectedness, dependence, that we're thinking not just in the silo of that meeting. Great.
Rod says, I might actually start having meetings with this design and way too pragmatic otherwise. I see them as waste. Gretchen says, allow for emergent energy. Stop being tied only to agenda.
Awesome. So stop doing agendas, right? Maybe it's emergent. I actually had a conversation with somebody tomorrow. They don't do agendas. No agendas. The agenda will emerge in the right people getting together. Awesome.
Gary says all members are parts of the whole.
Awesome. Yeah, so one of the things I really encourage is every person at a meeting has a role, and they need to be contributors and to recognize their role as a part of that. And so if they are contributors, then they have a voice and they need to participate.
Bell says every meeting needs to focus on health of the organization and staff.
Great.
How to inspire interaction when we are all so trained to just warm a seat.
Awesome. One of the things that may be powerful is what happens if you stop doing a meeting, right? So maybe sometimes it could be just, what if we cancel it? Does that change anything? And if it doesn't change anything, that may be telling you it wasn't adding anything, right? So that may be something else to consider.
Gary says, help the deficit of your leadership.
Good. So now it's developmental. So that's perfect. So now we use this as an opportunity to grow one another in that process. Awesome. Well, guys, thank you. As just a heartfelt thank you from In Rhythm, our team. Our desire is to provide and give you resources that can help you make and be more regenerative in your organizations, in your lives, and in the communities that you're a part of. I hope that this just gives you enough to move in the direction to support doing it differently. And so what we talk about is we plan these disturbance events. So this webinar is a disturbance event to create the conditions of health for you, your teams, and the communities or the systems that you're trying to transform.